It's a real honor to be here today, and I'm looking forward to having this chance to talk with all of you. We live in an amazing time. If we look at the last 10,000 years, the temperature has been incredibly stable, and this stability of climate has allowed the development of agriculture, the development of the great civilizations. This is what it means to be human, is what's happened in these last 10,000 years. But we also live in a time of very rapid change, where we appear to be moving outside of this zone of Holocene stability that's nurtured who we are as a species. And if we continue to impact the climate system in the way that we have, it's likely that within the lifetimes of our children and our grandchildren, that the Earth will become significantly less habitable than it is today. And this means lots of things. It means rising sea level, more severe hurricanes and storms, flooding in wet areas and drought in dry areas, and other associated environmental changes such as land cover change, clearing of forests for timber, for example. So how do we put this in perspective? If we think about the causes of these, we know what those are. To a large degree. We know that population has been increasing. We know that resource use has been increasing. And these changes in drivers have led to human impacts such as changes in climate and changes in land cover. These human impacts in turn have ecosystem consequences such as the extinction of species, the exploitation of fisheries. And these ecosystem consequences in turn have impacts on society. If we think about the benefits that we get from nature, ecosystem services, then we can see that 2/3 of those are decreasing in the global aggregate. So these are serious changes. But all of this is backed up by very strong science. But what we don't know as well is what society is going to do about it. Are we going to continue these trajectories, or are there ways in which we can turn this around? Now, you'll notice that all of these curves have the same basic structure, that in the last 50 to the last 70 years, there's been a tremendous acceleration. Now, 70 years is much too short a time to embed our dependence on fossil fuels in our genetic code. This is still a fixable problem, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. So we have to start out from where we are today. As human beings, we have at least two general kinds of instincts. Sorry about that. We have the instinct to compete for resources, to compete with one another, to acquire and hoard resources. And this, in turn, leads to an extraction of resources from ecosystems. It fuels consumerism, and it contributes to environmental degradation. It's not something that's just human. This is shared with every species on Earth, this competitive tendency. But we also have a capacity and an instinct to care and to cooperate. And this is strongest for family, but it also extends to environment and community. And this is responsible for those features of human society that we most cherish, the civilizations, cultures, religious features. And this, I think, is the key to moving away from these patterns of degradation that we've seen in the past. So I'd like to talk to you about stewardship, and especially stewardship at the level of what individuals can do about this. And what I would like to convince you today is that if we switch towards more of a commitment to care and empathy for others and for nature, that sustainability is within our grasp. We can turn this around. but it's not going to be easy. By stewardship, I mean the active shaping of pathways of social ecological change to enhance ecosystem health and resilience and human well-being. Basically, to look for pathways that are good for nature and for people. The key features are, first of all, active intervention to shape change rather than trying to return to some previous state. Systems of people as part of nature, and in the context of what this means for the Earth as a system. And there's two goals. One is ecosystem resilience, and the other is human well-being. So it's not a choosing between people or nature. It's people as part of nature. We know a lot about the science of stewardship, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But if we think about ecosystems, for example, there's a lot of work showing that if we sustain the soils of an ecosystem, sustain the climatic regime, and the biodiversity of a system, and the disturbance regime, that the characteristics of this system will be sustained for potentially thousands of years. If we sustain the properties of ecosystems and the functioning of ecosystems, then the benefits that society derives from ecosystems can also be sustained. And social scientists have a similar foundation of understanding for what is the basis of human well-being. But first I want to go back to the ecosystem changes. We can see here that ecosystem processes such as the diversity maintenance are really crucial for the ecosystem services that you see in the middle of the slide. The food and water and other goods that we harvest from ecosystems. The interactions, they mediate the interactions among ecosystems, such as the impact of cities on the climate of the world, which affects ecosystems everywhere. Regulation of water quantity and quality, fire regime. And there's also non-material benefits that we get from ecosystems, such as a sense of place, our sense of identity in relation to nature, and the cultural, the aesthetic and spiritual benefits that we derive from nature. Now, all of these ecosystem services influence human well-being. And human well-being, and together with social processes, this influences a lot of the decisions that we make about what to do with ecosystems. And these decisions can range from stewardship, in which we sustain or restore the health of ecosystems and of society, all the way to exploitation and resource extraction, which reduce the capacity of ecosystems to provide the services that we need. Now, the science of the sustaining of human well-being also depends on the underlying foundations and processes, and leads to outcomes that society cares about. If we think about well-being outcomes, these are ones that were outlined by Abraham Maslow 75 years ago. These are the sorts of things that people everywhere on Earth need. They need food and water, safety, security, love and belonging, self-esteem and respect, and the capacity to meet personal and societal goals. But it's not the outcomes that enable us to think about the interventions. The interventions need to be designed with respect to the processes that give rise to these outcomes. And not only the processes that are happening at any moment in time, but what enables these processes to be sustained over multiple generations, the foundations of long-term well-being. So for thinking of food and water safety and security, for example, it's important to sustain the environment and to sustain human health over the long term if we want to maintain those environmental and material conditions that give rise to the outcomes that we want. Social rules and institutions give rise to the social relationships that are really crucial in determining love and belonging and interactions among people. Values determine the long-term basis for empowerment. Education increases the capacity of people to meet their goals. So all of these things are foundations of human well-being, and there's a good solid science that underlies a lot of these generalizations. So if I think about the main strategies for change, the main things that are needed today, two things jump up to me in particular. One is to broaden our concept of the economic system, to foster inclusive wealth of nations rather than the material wealth of nations. Our current economic system is largely focused on increasing material goods, material wealth. But if we go to inclusive wealth of nation, this includes the natural capital as well as the built capital and infrastructure. It includes the human capital that is developed through education and training, and the social capital that derives from the relationships that we have with one another. So if we can internalize the environmental and social costs of the actions that we're taking that disrupt ecosystems, then there's ways in which the costs can more fully represent the total benefits and costs surrounding material benefit, material goods, natural capital, social capital, and human capital. And this, I think, if we can incorporate all of these costs in the same economic system, in the same calculus, then I think there's ways in which we could make use of the self-organizing properties of the current economic system and shift to a stewardship economy that's based on the material, natural, social, and human capital in ways that no longer degrade planet Earth. And I'd like to give you just one example of one possible way to do this. A carbon tax, for example, would incentivize people to use less fossil fuels. And if the revenues from this tax were distributed equally to all the residents of a nation, then it would also reduce the inequality of income between those that are richest and those that are poorest. And this change in incentives would lead to innovation to use more renewable energy, reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. And there's many other examples where I think we can make use of institutions that have been tried out and experimented with in one place or another and incorporate these into the economic system in such a way that we're no longer focused on material wealth, but we're focused on inclusive wealth that includes natural capital, social capital, and human capital. But this is going to require a shift in social norms, which is the second big issue that strikes me. And here I think we have to think about how we can shift the balance from social norms that are based on competition to those that are based on caring. If people's behavior was focused on their caring for other people in society and caring for nature, then this would solve the tragedy of the commons, in which people's selfish actions to increase their own wealth and acquisition of material goods leads to bad outcomes for everybody. If we prioritized caring for others and for nature, then pursuing that goal would lead to good outcomes for everybody. I'd like to talk about 4 tiers of types of actions that people can pursue, starting with individual actions, dialogue to define common goals, collaboration for collective action, and shaping social and political change. In terms of individual actions, the easiest and most fun thing to do is just to celebrate our connections with nature. This is fun. It means building our sense of place, strengthening our sense of place, helping give others a sense of connection to nature. In particular, I think it's important to connect kids and friends and other people who may not spend much time in nature with nature more effectively. If kids become exposed to nature, they will incorporate this value, this sense of place that will enable them to carry on the same values for their children and grandchildren. And this allows the building of and sustaining of values across generations. So I just want to show you an example from my family. This is, that's my grandfather when he was a teenager. His father, he grew up in New York City. He was the third generation of city kids from this. There were 3 generations of people that just lived in New York City. But once a year, they went off camping and doing things. And his father took him fishing, and his mother painted landscapes. And he really incorporated a sense of connection with nature, even though he spent only a tiny proportion of his life doing that. Then he took his family on picnics, camping, and fishing. My father took my sister and I camping and fishing and doing things. Since we live in Alaska, my wife, Mimi, and I took our kids out, and such that they really enjoyed times they spent in nature. And now my son Keith lives in Cardiff, Wales, and he takes his kids, Adele, who's here today, and Emil, out in nature. So city kids to city kids, but the value of nature, the sense of place, the sense of connection to nature has been sustained through that because each generation has taken their kids out and done the same kinds of things. Reducing unnecessary consumption is another important aspect of individual actions. And there's 2 parts of this: reducing population growth and reducing per capita consumption. Now here I think the real trick is to reframe the conversation. So in terms of reducing population growth, just forget about that as part of the conversation, but instead focus it on things. It's such a sensitive topic in so many different cultures. So if we think in developing nations, for example, about education for girls, this is the intervention that's been proven most successful to reducing population growth in developing nations. And it's a win-win situation. It empowers women to take charge of their lives and do things that they want to do. There's no reason to bring population into discussion. And I think the same thing's true in all nations with respect to unwanted pregnancies. If there are ways in which women can avoid, or men and women can avoid unwanted pregnancies, then this is good for everybody. So reframing the conversations as opportunities rather than as things to be given up, I think is really important. In terms of reducing per capita consumption, those of us who lived in developed nations have an unusual opportunity because this is the ecological footprint, which is the ratio of the resources used by society, the resources exploited, divided by the resources that are actually regenerated within that country. So here, for example, the United States, Europe, and Japan are quite bloated because they use much more resources than are generated within those countries, and therefore they have an impact on resource extraction elsewhere in the world. Other places, such as South America and Africa, use much less resources. So this means that those of us who live in developed nations have at least 32-fold greater potential impact on reducing the human footprint on the planet than do people living in developing nations on average. So it's an opportunity for us to do things if we care. So this comes down to choosing what we want and need. And part of this, I think, is pursuing non-consumptive dimensions of happiness. Time spent with family and friends, and providing opportunities for our kids to do music, play sports, find educational opportunities outside the classroom. All of these things reduce our levels of consumption. Rather than spending longer hours at work, we can spend more time with family and friends. There's other ways of reducing unnecessary consumption as well. First of all, supporting the consumption of things that we're proud of. Supporting the consumption of local agricultural goods, for example, or supporting the businesses that are an integral part of our local economy. Buying things that we want to keep and use for a long time because we're proud of them, rather than buying a phone which we intend to replace within a year or two. Another part of this is making good use of social conformity as a way to shift social norms. And those norms that are easiest to shift, to move towards something that's more sustainable, are those that are highly visible. So take some of the norms that we would like to encourage society to take on, such as not smoking, bicycling to work, recycling. These are things that are publicly visible, so it's relatively easy for people to see these kinds of things. And if people see their neighbors doing this and want to be like their neighbors, or see their role models doing this and want to be like their role models, it's easy for them to see that and to copy that behavior. Negative norms are also highly conspicuous. Think about conspicuous consumption. Expensive car, big houses, fancy clothes. These are things that are deliberately conspicuous. So these are also norms that are highly susceptible to being changed if society changes to a set of values that respect things other than commercial goods. And this brings us to thinking about how do we make choices among these various things. There's many different ways in which our behavior could be more favorable for the climate system by reducing emissions. So here, for example, are the commonly recommended climate actions. As you can see, they have much less impact than some of these other things that we might do that would have much greater impact, such as deciding to have one less child, not flying on a transatlantic flight as I just did. But the other thing about these big levers for change is that there's intermediate options. You don't have to go cold turkey about never eating meat, but you can try it just on Fridays, or just 3 days a week, or just 6 days a week. And so there's lots of ways to test out each of these things, see how it fits with your lifestyle, your suite of values, and then decide whether or not to move towards that. So I think there's ways in which we can think about shifting social norms, changing our behavior in ways that are not totally intimidating to other people and that are not entirely a matter of sacrificing things we really care about. So now I'd like to shift to communication. And here, the two big issues I feel are building trust with your audience and identifying points of agreement. If we're going to shift social norms, we have to have conversations about it, or people need to watch our behavior and decide that that's something that they want to take on. And what I'd like to do is just give one example of a project that I've been involved in, and that's this community partnership for self-reliance. And this is a collaboration between Indigenous communities in Alaska and the University of Alaska. And in response to conversations with Native leaders, I came to realize that if we wanted to have a partnership that really met the needs of communities, we needed to put their needs first and my needs as a researcher second. So in all of these projects that we've taken on, the role of the community is to define the goals, define the purpose. And the role of the researcher is to listen, clarify, listen, and look for solutions. Help work with the community to look for solutions. Now this means a couple of things that intimidated me considerably at first. One is the idea of sharing power. This means that I can't, at the very beginning of a research project, decide what the hypotheses are, what the study design is going to be, and go out and implement that. I have to let the communities make those decisions, and then I have to adjust within the context of what the community decides is important. Now that's a really exciting research framework if I think of the research as finding the way to have this co-production of knowledge with communities. But if I think of some concrete goal, I might have a more difficult time doing this. And it also means that many of the things that communities will decide are important are things where I have no skills or knowledge. And so I'll need to look for partners to help out on this. I'd become a matchmaker rather than integral to the research program. In working with these communities, one of the things that surprised me was that for all of the communities we worked with, their core goal, their core core intention was to maintain a strong culture, to maintain a strong relationship to the land. These are communities where half of the population is below the poverty line. So I came there thinking that jobs would be important, that economic improvement would be high on their list of priorities, but that wasn't at the top of the list. And through discussions, we've found that there were ways in which we could work with them to help them meet interactions with Western culture in ways that enable them to maintain and strengthen their culture. So for example, many of these communities had difficulties meeting subsistence needs because of regulations that were established by regulatory bodies that were primarily based in cities and didn't really care about what happened in rural communities. High cost of energy was another area that was of extreme importance to the community, such as things such as they had energy inefficient houses, and there were real difficulties in integrating renewable energy with diesel power systems, which was necessary in these islanded grids that are disconnected from the main electrical grids in Alaska. So in these cases, I was either able to help them navigate the conversations with regulatory boards or put them in touch with researchers who had the skills to deal with some of these other issues that they were directly concerned about. Now, working with Indigenous communities seems like a sort of a special case of communication, but it's really not. Anytime we get into interdisciplinary issues, I find that the same issues jump to the front. If I'm trying to work across disciplines, if I want to collaborate with social scientists, I need to build trust. I need to understand what they're talking about from their worldview, from their perspective. I need to understand their issues before we can think about how to do things together. The same is true in interactions between academics and religious groups. I need to understand their perspective and why they care for creation, why they care about vulnerable people, and why sometimes this leads in stewardship actions on their behalf and other times it doesn't. And before I can understand those things and see it from their perspective, I can't develop a meaningful collaboration and partnership with them. And the same is true with co-production of knowledge and search for solutions with practitioners and policymakers. Another aspect of effective communication is looking for opportunities for generally positive messages when you're talking to general audiences. Now here's another place where I fell down badly. When I first began getting interested in issues of climate change, I focused in talking about how bad the problem was. And that was as far as I got. And people disengaged from this kind of a conversation because they blame themselves, they see it as an impossible situation, they don't know what they can do about it. But if I can link these pressing problems with solutions, with things they can do something about, then that's a positive opportunity. It empowers them rather than disempowers them. So looking for solution-focused discussions rather than blaming people. One of the more difficult parts of this is with people who don't have the same worldviews that I do. But again, I think the same general approach is important. It's important to listen respectfully. Even if I don't agree with their worldview, I need to understand why they believe that. What are the values that we hold in common, and what are our points of disagreement? And once I've begun to sort that out, then it's helpful to think about which of the aspects of disagreement are because of disinformation or lack of common understanding, and which reflect deep values that would be very difficult to change. And so respectful listening is important in putting myself inside their heads. It's also important, I think, to look for ways to avoid false dichotomies, such as jobs versus the environment. So many of the political discussions that happen in the United States are focused on these false dichotomies, which if you unpack them and look at all of the various components of these issues, there are some really genuine problems and genuine solutions. But if you're just talking about jobs versus environment, you're never going to come to a solution. So that's another thing to avoid. And in some cases, there'll be people who just will never agree with my perspective on things, no matter how carefully I try to frame the conversation. And here I think it's important to find messengers that these people trust. And one such person is Catherine Hayhoe, who's a climate scientist who also happens to be an evangelical Christian. And we invited her to Alaska, and she spoke to an audience there. And this was the reaction of the audience to her talk. It's the first time I've seen an audience just jump to their feet and give her a standing ovation as a result of things that she had to say about connecting science to actions, and about communicating with general audiences, and about meeting the connections between religious perspectives and scientific perspectives. I think there's some real challenges in social media, but I don't have time to go into those right now. A third topic that I wanted to talk about is commitment to collaboration. And this is a really useful way to get beyond just what you can do as an individual to what you can do as a group, and that's likely to be much more powerful. So again, I think you start by building on common interests and concerns. I'm really intrigued with this program in the United States, MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. It was founded by a woman whose daughter was killed by a drunk driver, and she just didn't see any way that she could prevent this from happening to other kids in other families. So she founded this organization that's advocated very strongly for tighter regulations against drunk driving, for raising the age at which people can begin to drive. And even though there's more cars on the road in the United States now than when this organization was founded, there's half as many alcohol-related fatalities. That's the sort of thing where if you can have an effective common goal, common interest, and bring people around to it, you can just be amazingly effective in accomplishing things that might seem impossible. I think we have an unusual opportunity right now because it's increasingly clear that our children and their children are going to face an extremely inhospitable environment. If there's any time we care for our children and want to take action that'll give them a better opportunity, now's the time to do it. There's some well-grounded principles for ways in which groups can collaborate. It often involves, I'll learn this before I'm done, maybe. Face-to-face dialogue, which enables trust building, a commitment to the processes, shared understanding, and even if the only outcome this leads to is that people don't yell at each other and actually have a conversation, that's a good starting point, and then you can take the next round of interactions. And one of the things that's really striking to me is that this happens easily when people have a common set of values and concerns, but it also happens really readily when there's a highly combative relationship, for example, between conservationists and loggers, if the problem can't be solved without them coming together to work on it together. So coming together to find livelihoods, protection of forests, and a community in which people are civil to one another. There's many, many examples where these sorts of difficult conversations have led to much more collaborative outcomes as a result of going through collaborative processes. Paul Hawkins estimated that there's about 2 million groups worldwide that are concerned with some aspect of environmental or social justice, and that together these constitute the biggest social movement in the history of humanity. But this social movement is almost invisible because each of these groups is acting on its own. So I think one of the one of the real opportunities is finding ways to get these groups together through bridging organizations. And one group that I've become really excited about is one that occurs locally in Fairbanks, the Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition, whose goal is to develop actions that reduce rates of climate change and facilitate adaptation to climate change. Now, this has several working groups. There's a faith working group that works with churches, especially conservative churches. There's a renewable energy working group that works with the local utility. Policy and politics group that works with various political organization and management agencies. A Green New Deal working group that is focused on thinking about ways to modify the economy to bring greater equity among people. And a political action working group that is very much involved in protests to prevent more oil extraction in Alaska. Now, each of these working groups agrees on the same general goals and principles, but each of them has a different conversation with the groups with which they collaborate, because the things that those other groups care about and the people in those groups care about are different things. And to have the political action working group talking to conservative audiences and churches is just not going to work. So I think recognizing that we have many principles that extend beyond the conversations that we want to have or can have is important. Political action is the final dimension of actions that citizens can take. I think we need to fulfill our responsibilities. First of all, to actively inform ourselves rather than just listening to social media. Secondly, to vote, and if you're inclined, to participate in government in one way or another. The presidential elections in the United States are, on average, decided by less than 5% of the popular vote. If we could persuade 10% of the population to act on the basis of stewardship norms, we could shift the whole political conversation, the political arena around in one election cycle. So it's not out of reach, I don't think. And finally, protests are another way to deal with these kinds of issues, nonviolent protests. So, and protests can be a good way to think about strategies for transformation. Per Olson's going to be talking a lot more about this later, so I won't say too much about this. But if you want to transform the system to a new set of intent, such as I've been talking about today, then you need to prepare for this in some very strategic ways, and there's really clear ways to do this. You need to think about how you're going to navigate the transition. This often means taking advantages of some crisis, using that as an opportunity. And finally, if you're successful, you're going to build a very fragile new system that has the danger of retreating back to what it was before. And so you need to find ways to incentives to strengthen and the resilience of the new system. So in summary, we inhabit a planet that's in transition. And the trajectory from here is really ours to choose. And one of the things that I am particularly concerned about is the future of today's youth. My granddaughter's here in the audience today. I really care about what the life that she's going to live as she grows up. So I think refocusing societal intent towards stewardship based on care for others and for nature is one way to think about this. And I've talked about individual actions, communication, collaboration, and political action as dimensions of the ways to do this. And one of the things that's particularly striking to me is that each of these individual steps is feasible. We know it is because it's been done many times. And the challenge is to integrate them and scale them up and out. But I'm cautiously optimistic. One of the things about bad situations such as we have at present is that it breeds so many opportunities to make things better. And there's a match, in terms of making things better, there's a match for almost anybody's interests and skills. And there's lots of groups doing great things. There's lots of demonstrated successes, many role models for how to do things well. So we know, and as I mentioned before, we know that each of these steps is feasible. And so the challenge is to integrate and scale it up and out. And I don't think we can wait for somebody else to solve the problem. We've got to do it. Thank you.
Okay. So we have time for questions, and we have some mics here.
I can't see anybody, so, I mean, I can't see any hands, so if you can choose. Yes.
Thanks very much. My name is Catherine Richardson. I'm coming from the University of Copenhagen. And I enjoyed that, but I had one in your communication. I was almost surprised to hear you talking about the word solution. Personally, I find that solution is, I think words are very important when you choose them, and I think solution gives the impression that if we just find this thing or this process, then we can sit back and this will be business as usual. But what I usually say to people is that, you know, our ancestors, when they stopped running around after their food and got to change to faster dress, I'm sure they let their waste fall wherever it was produced, and they took whatever they thought they wanted to need from nature. Then they realized they had to manage their relationship. We're still doing that today. We didn't get it over with, and we've lost our innocence. We have to manage our relationship with the planet at the global level. And so I find using the word solution is maybe detrimental, and I'd like to hear your call on that.
That's a wonderful comment, and I totally agree. Maybe what I should have said is that we should be searching for solution pathways rather than solutions. Strategies for getting towards a more favorable relationship between people and nature rather than finding a way to solve the problem and get on with business. No,
Yeah,
I totally agree with you.
That's what I try and do, and also that you know, sustainability isn't a place or a state, it's a process. Mm-hmm. And we're continually working towards improving the ratio between what we get out of human well-being and the cost in terms of the environment.
That's right.
I don't know if windmills are a solution and will be here in 2050, but they're a damn good help right now.
That's right. That's right. Excellent point.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm Lisa Deutsch. I'm back here. You can't see. Thank you. I'm a researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and I also sit on the Scientific Advisory Council at CEDA. And I was there yesterday listening to the World Bank present their World Development Report, where they pretty much presented a worldview that's totally different than what you just talked about. And so I'm rather discouraged too, and I'm a little bit sad. Or not sad, I mean, you mentioned, I heard a lot of emphasis on individuals and our responsibilities, and I think we are really struggling to find transformation that is at system level. We are really, really working hard for that, and I work with trade, and I work with these issues, and I work to strengthen maybe even at the national level, but I'm just kind of, you know, you said it was a big challenge. Right at the end you said our challenge now is to scale up and scale out.
That's right.
And and you know, you're a wise person. You have such an emphasis still on individuals, and I find I can reach individuals, and I can even reach maybe smaller organizations at the Swedish level, but to talk to somebody yesterday, like at the World Bank, because they talked about global value chains and how basically it was a promotional, seemed like, report for how good globalization is and how wonderful everything is now that we've got economic values, because that's the only value that's included in the World Bank's global value chain analysis. So where is the best leverage point for us to really get to this kind of change? I mean, I can see there's a lot of really good leverage points. Do we need, how can we scale up? Because I really see the potential at the level of the World Bank, but I don't see any even interest or understanding of the idea of inclusive wealth.
Yeah, that's a wonderful comment, and there's several points to make perhaps in response. I totally agree that there needs to be institutional changes, and that there's roles that governments and NGOs can make that individuals can never make. There's also individuals who operate within those organizations, and they are going to be making the same kinds of choices that those of us sitting in the room will make. And so I think looking for individual actions for people who are parts of power for social networks are really important. And then finally, I suspect that a lot of government actions are only going to take place if there's popular support for those among citizens. In the United States, the turnover of politicians is so rapid that unless people really step up and say that these are my values, these are the things I care about, the politicians are going to be more worried about staying in office and promoting the things that will enable them to raise money to do their next campaign than they are in solving real social issues. So I think there are ways in which individual action can still be important at large scales and as a way of changing the way things happen in government. But the actions of individuals have to be done in some ways that are coordinated with the actions of governments and business and NGOs and other groups. Excellent points.
Hi, my name is Alicia. I'm from Bergen University. Thanks for a wonderful talk. Just following on from that question, I was really interested in how you talked about how the environmental movement has actually been a massive movement. It's just been kind of undercover. And I thought that was really interesting. And I just wanted to ask you, like you as an American, I find the civil rights movement a really inspiring movement of like collective action and civil disobedience. And I was wondering how you what are your stances on all of these kind of social movements of collective action and civil disobedience that are, yes.
Actually, I've got a very personal story to tell you there. The first time I was arrested was for demonstrating against segregation in my hometown of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, in the southeastern U.S. And it happened at a time when there was a lot of recognition that this was a really important issue, and it was a community that prided itself for being relatively liberal. I had grown up in that town, so I was viewed as being a member of the community. And things fairly quickly moved towards a much less segregated place. The second time I was arrested was in a community near my college. And that was a place where I was an outsider and where the community had no particular interest in moving away from their segregated stance. And when my wife and I went back to our 50th college reunion and talked to people from that town, apparently not much had changed in the last 50 years. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Depends a lot on social context.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.